Vikings. The word calls up images of giants, grim warriors and fearless sailors capable of bravery and barbarism in equal measure. They hailed from the Scandinavian countries now known as Norway, Sweden and Denmark. The bleak, mountainous interiors of their homelands made them an outward-looking people from the start. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, they began pushing their longboats out from the fjords, scanning the horizons for precious land and sources of trade, and terrorizing the hapless Europeans who stood in their way. For more than 500 years, they swept into Europe, east, south, and west. The westward-looking Norwegians would move stepwise across the Atlantic, from the British Isles to Iceland to Greenland, and finally to a mysterious place called Vinland, somewhere in America. Every schoolchild knows that the rogue Viking Leif Erikson set foot in the New World long before Columbus's historic voyage. But until recently, just how the Scandinavians managed this navigational feat remained a mystery. The questions persist. Did they try to colonize the Americas? And how much of their seafaring skill did they bequeath to medieval Europe?
Well, the more I've sailed in these small, after all small and open ships, the more respect I have gotten for these people. They were extremely brave. They must have been very, very clever shipbuilders, sailors, navigators. They must have been very well organized, and I mean, they were fantastic.
Ragnar Thorseth, adventurer from Norway, knows the seafaring ways of the Vikings as intimately as anyone. For the last decade, Thorseth had dedicated himself to building replicas of Viking ships and sailing them round the world.
What we have been interested in is to learn as much as possible about the ship, seaworthiness, speed, and of course to learn how to sail them, so that we better can understand how it was possible for the Vikings to not only to sail once across the North Atlantic, but to cross it regularly 1,000 years ago.
The archaeology of boats is a relatively new frontier in the science of the past. Working with scholars from the Viking ship museums in Norway and Denmark, Ragnar has tried to remain as faithful to the original Viking shipbuilding craft as possible.
What is unique for Scandinavian shipbuilding at that time is the clink building technique. Most ships today the planks are like this, but the Viking ships, it's more like this, and then they are nailed together. And first you build up the ships with the planking, and then later on you put in the ribs, while in most other traditions they do it the opposite way.
Thorseth's fleet consists of replicas of 3 ships. Gaia, a copy of the largest Viking ship yet found, built in 850 AD as a raiding vessel and probably once the property of a king. The Oseberg, a copy of a royal yacht dating from about 800 AD, is the most elegant of the Viking ships. The original was built for protected waters and never meant to see the high seas. The Saga Sigla, the most seaworthy of the 3 vessels, is an 11th century Viking trader.
Well, if I were to cross the North Atlantic again, I would go for the Saga Sigla, the Knar. But if I were to compete in America's Cup, I would go for the Gaia. Beautiful, fast ship, really.
The story of the Vikings' expansion is intimately connected to the characteristics of the land they inhabited, the conditions that drove them outwards. Europe was helpless against the pagan horde. Wielding axes and swords with gruesome skill, the Vikings knew no reason to spare civilians, women, and children from their attacks. They ventured as far south as Spain, perhaps even sailing occasionally into the Mediterranean. In the 9th century, they grew strong enough to sack London and lay siege to Paris. settled parts of Ireland, northern England, and conquered the city of York.
Well, I think we've completely revolutionized people's idea of the Viking era in York. People used to think of the Vikings coming and just destroying the city, but we've seen a picture where they come and they inject new life into the place, and they lay it out with the streets and the properties and the churches and the buildings, which you can still see today. The lines of the properties still exist 1,000 years after, but they have their origin in the Viking Age. So the Vikings came as traders and as merchants, and they gave York new economic life.
From there, they struck out ever westward. The Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland. In the process, they became learned seamen.
We are pretty sure that they were able to establish the latitude they were on, and that they would follow the latitude. We are pretty sure that they had a sun compass to help them establish the latitude. We also know that they were well familiar with the planets, with the stars. For instance, the polar star, they called that the leading star, so they would always know the true north. And of course, any time when it was clear weather, they would have the sun and the moon and the other planets. The problems, I guess, came up when they for many days had bad weather and couldn't see the sky. Then they could get lost, but that was actually a good thing too, because the first man to get a sight of Greenland, he was lost. And also the first man, according to the tradition at least, to get the sight of Vinland or America. He was in his way from Norway to Greenland, and he got lost in a storm, and so
Our source for those westward journeys are two sagas, both of which tell of the volatile clan of Eric the Red. Theirs is a tale of discovery driven by violence and exile. Eric's father, exiled from Norway on charges of manslaughter, took his family to Iceland. Eric himself, exiled from Iceland after several fights and killings, set off in 986 to settle on the island of Greenland. Eventually, the colony would grow to several thousand settlers. It conducted brisk trade with Europe for several centuries.
Greenland was a rich country. It had many resources which Europe wanted in the medieval period. Things as prosaic as walrus hide, which were used for ships' ropes, through things as mysterious as narwhal tusk, which throughout medieval Europe was considered to be the unicorn horn, the horn of this sort of very mystical and mythical beast. The main commodity, however, was ivory. And walrus ivory from the tusks of the walrus that lived in more northerly waters of Greenland was the main form in which tributes and various tithes were paid to Europe by the Greenlanders.
The Vikings continued to look westward across the Atlantic. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, one Bjarni Herjolfsson was driven off course while trying to reach Greenland and sighted North America in 986. He did not go ashore, but he carried the knowledge of the continent back to Greenland. In about 1000, Eric the Red's son, Leif, decided to strike out for the mysterious westward land to see if it might be suitable for colonization. According to the sagas, Leif's expedition first happened upon a barren landscape backdropped by mountains and glaciers. Leif dubbed the place Helund, or Land of Flat Rocks. Scholars believe this to be Baffin Island. Sailing southward, they then pulled ashore on a wooded place with a gently sloping shoreline and broad white beaches. This they named Markland, or Land of the Forest. It was probably Labrador.
Then to the south of that was a third land, which they called Vinland. And this is the one that the questions are about. We don't know exactly where Vinland was, except that it was somewhere to the south of Labrador.
For years, scholars have debated the truth of the sagas and the location of Vinland, even the meaning of the term Vinland.
Hann mælti þá á norrænu stund leið, var gengin eigi miklu lengra. He spoke then the Norse language and said, I have something new to tell you. I found wines and grapes.
The name Vinland was given to the land by Leif Erikson in the sagas because, as he said, because of the good qualities that it has. Now, this has been a controversy in scholarship ever since because people want to, in modern days, see it as V-I-N with an accent on the I, Vinland, meaning land of wine or land of grapevines. But in Leif Erikson's time, they really had no knowledge of grapevines or wine. There was an Old Norse word, V-I-N without the accent, Vinland, which referred to pasture land. And in fact, any Norse explorer finding a new land would have had as his first priority to find pasture land. They lived on their cattle. They carried cattle with them in their ships as they went exploring. And their first priority was find a place for the cattle to graze.
Well, Norse people would settle in a land where the old pattern of culture fitted. I mean, in Newfoundland, they would find what they were used to, hunting seals, hunting caribou, and all that stuff. And furthermore, it was very important to stop in time, don't sail too long, because I lived in the wilds for many, many years in the northern part, and the preparations for the winter, on that depends life and death. They had to build houses, they had to hunt, they had to fish, and prepare for the winter.
It was here, in northern Newfoundland, that the definitive evidence was finally found. Norwegian archaeologists Helga and Anna Stina Ingstad spent the better part of a decade sailing up and down the Atlantic coast of North America, looking for clues of the Vikings. In 1961, they arrived at Lance aux Meadows.
Dr. Ingstad is a Norwegian explorer, but his wife Anna Stina was the archaeologist. And they arrived in Lance aux Meadows by accident, really, and they met with the local spokesman of the community, Mr. George Decker. Dr. Ingstad asked Mr. Decker if there was anything unusual, any humps or bumps or mounds around, and Mr. Decker said, yes, there are some Indian campsites up by Black Duck Brook.
And there it was. Even if it was so overgrown as it was, and it was made very clear that it was remains of old houses. But we didn't know, of course, who had built these houses. There might have been Indians, there might have been Eskimos, there might have been fishermen, it might have been whalers, and at last it might have been Norsemen. Only excavation could tell the story. But personally, I had a strong feeling from my experience in Greenland and in western part of Norway that this was a place that the Norse people would like to build their homes.
The Viking presence on North American soil some 500 years before the voyages of Christopher Columbus has now been definitively established at Lance aux Meadows. How is it possible then that such a monumental discovery would gradually fade from memory, that by the time of Columbus the notion of sailing off the edge of the world would again lurk in the imaginations of European explorers? The answer? It probably didn't. In 1957, Yale University acquired a rather stunning map dating from the mid-1400s. On its western extremity appears the island of Vinland. 400 years after life's journey, and 50 before Columbus's. If authentic, the map proves that the reality of transatlantic crossing was still present in the minds of Europeans.
Part of the controversy about the Vinland map is the question of its provenance. There are speculations that it did actually come from a Spanish library in a private family library that was perhaps trying to avoid the Spanish regulation on exporting antiquities.
Indeed, the map raised such intriguing questions that several scholars sought a simpler answer. It was a forgery. And close examination revealed that the ink on the document contained titanium oxide, a chemical available only in the 20th century.
But I've shown a way that there could have been a transfer of this titanium dioxide into the ink in modern times as an accidental transfer during cleaning. In the mid-1950s, tissue paper of some manufacturer for a few years did contain commercial titanium dioxide, exactly the material that has been found in the map.
There is, however, reason to believe the map authentic. On the upper left-hand corner is inscribed a long secret message in code, a cryptogram.
The discovery of the cryptogram in the inscriptions of the Vinland map shows that someone went to an awful lot of trouble to incorporate these cryptograms in the inscription. One does not create a cryptogram hidden in an inscription except by an awful lot of very hard retrying work, and just one change of one word in this inscription could destroy the structure of the entire cryptogram. For a forger to go to all the effort to incorporate two cryptograms in two separate inscriptions in the map is very difficult for me to imagine.
If the map is indeed authentic, it testifies that the Vikings had lost nothing of their navigational skills in the years preceding the momentous voyages of Columbus.
Columbus did definitely know about the Vikings and their voyages to North America. Remember that Columbus was born less than 50 years after the last Viking ship sailed from Norway to Greenland. We also know that Columbus was in Bristol when he was a young sailor, and Bristol was an important harbor, and they had lots of ships sailing up to Iceland and also to Greenland. So the Viking voyages, it was a living tradition. Some people also, or some science also say that Columbus went to Iceland, so he most definitely knew that there were land on the other side of the big ocean.
Greenlanders discovered or sailed to America. Greenland was colonized from Iceland, and so when we think America being found by Europeans, there are mainly Greenlanders who sailed from Greenland to the continent of America. We don't speak of Christopher Columbus in this country.
The Indians were there a long time before both Columbus and the Vikings, so the Vikings were probably the first Europeans in North America, but I mean they were there for a short period. Columbus, of course, opened up America for the Europeans.
It is too easy in this day and age to forget the true magnitude of the Vikings' achievements, to underestimate the elemental forces they challenged. But Ragnar Thorseth is not likely to forget. In May 1992, the valiant trader, the Saga Sigla, and the elegant royal yacht Oseberg foundered in a sudden storm off the coast of Spain. Luckier than their Viking forebears, the crew survived to tell the tale and to build and sail Viking ships once again. What extraordinarily brave men they must have been. pushing their open longboats into the fjords of Scandinavia, setting sail for unknown, hostile lands. An epic saga in themselves, these voyages wrote a heroic prelude to the European age of discovery, leaving one to ponder, will we ever know the extent of the debt that Columbus owed his Viking predecessors?
Viking.